The galaxy was wide, filled with countless stars and worlds. Among those worlds lived many species, and some of them had built great civilizations. Yet not all of them were warriors. Some had chosen the path of peace so completely that the thought of raising a weapon or fighting back was something they could hardly imagine. They believed that the safest way to live was to remain quiet, hidden, and harmless in the eyes of those who ruled with strength. For them, survival meant silence. When the invaders began their campaign across the galaxy, these peaceful species did what they always had done. They watched. They saw entire planets fall without a single shot fired. They saw proud civilizations bow their heads, sign treaties, and hand over their futures just to save themselves from being destroyed. For the peaceful ones, this was not shocking. It was what they had always expected. To them, resistance was nothing but another path to extinction. But then came Earth. From the first day, humanity did not behave as the invaders had predicted. Instead of surrendering, the people of Earth shouted, fought, and refused to kneel. Entire cities were threatened, yet their voices only grew louder. The peaceful species who observed from afar could not believe what they were seeing. They had expected Earth to follow the same pattern as all the others, to bow, to give up, to choose survival over pride. Instead, humanity chose to stand against an enemy they could not hope to defeat. The observers sat in their councils, their halls of glass and light, staring at the transmissions that came across the stars. They saw humans with broken weapons standing before towering machines. They saw families huddled together in ruins, not in despair, but whispering words of courage. They saw leaders of Earth addressing their people, not with surrender, but with determination. The peaceful ones did not know whether to admire this or to call it madness. For generations, they had told themselves that peace was the only answer. They had built lives around avoiding danger, convincing themselves that they were wise to never provoke the powerful. But now, in the burning skies of Earth, they saw a truth they had never faced before. Perhaps peace without choice was not peace at all. Perhaps it was just another kind of slavery. Still, even as these thoughts began to stir, they hesitated. They had no armies, no weapons, no history of rebellion. To them, the human spirit seemed like fire, beautiful, dangerous, impossible to control. They whispered among themselves, would this fire destroy Earth completely? Or would it somehow light a path the rest of the galaxy had been too afraid to walk? Days turned into weeks, and the invaders struck harder. Cities on Earth fell, but the humans did not bow. Instead, they picked up the pieces and stood again. Even the children of Earth learned the meaning of resistance. They painted symbols of defiance on walls. They sang songs of hope in the darkest nights, and they promised each other that no matter what came, they would never kneel. The observers watched these images in silence. In their hearts, something began to stir, a feeling they could not quite name. It was not courage, not yet. It was more like a question. If humans, fragile as they were compared to the invaders' machines, could still find strength in the ruins, then what excuse did anyone else have for remaining silent? Some of the peaceful species tried to dismiss the thought. They said humanity was reckless, that resistance was foolish, that fire would only bring destruction. Yet others began to wonder if perhaps recklessness was another name for bravery. Perhaps what the galaxy had called foolishness for so long was the only thing strong enough to break chains. Night after night, they gathered around their glowing displays, watching the flames of Earth. In those flames, they saw something new. They saw mothers holding their children tightly, but whispering words of strength instead of fear. They saw men and women standing on broken streets with nothing in their hands, but still shouting at the skies. They saw entire groups of people, linking arms together, knowing death could fall from above, yet refusing to scatter. For the peaceful observers, it was unlike anything they had ever known. They had always thought survival was about hiding, about waiting, about keeping quiet, until the storm passed. But humanity was teaching them something else. Survival could also mean refusing to give up your soul, even if everything else was taken away. At first, they told themselves they were only watching out of curiosity. But in truth, they were searching for something. In every transmission from Earth, they found a piece of the answer. Humanity was weak in weapons, weak in numbers, but strong in will. And in that will, there was a kind of power the invaders could not seem to crush. One of the observers finally said what many were already thinking. Perhaps the humans are not the ones who are foolish. Perhaps we are for believing that silence is the only path. The others did not reply, but the thought echoed among them. It spread like a whisper from world to world. The galaxy had always looked down on humanity as young, reckless, and stubborn. But now, that stubbornness was shining in the darkness, and even those who had never lifted a hand in defiance were beginning to feel its warmth. And so, the silent watchers kept their eyes on Earth. They could not yet move, could not yet act, but they could not turn away. They were waiting to see what humanity would do next. Somewhere deep inside, a seed had been planted. It was small, fragile, and uncertain, but it was real. The seed was called defiance, and it had been born not in their own hearts, but in the fire of Earth. That was the beginning. The moment when the galaxy's quiet ones first began to question everything they had ever believed about survival. The moment when they realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than silence. Humanity was still fighting, still, refusing to kneel, and in the shadows, the peaceful species were no longer only watchers. They were listeners, learners, and slowly, without knowing it, they were being changed. The first real test came sooner than anyone had expected. The invaders had circled the skies for days, sending warnings through strange broadcasts that echoed across every device and every corner of the planet. They spoke in a language that was not human, but their meaning was always clear. Kneel, obey, surrender, or face the flames. For most of the galaxy's species, those words alone would have been enough. Entire civilizations had fallen with nothing more than that threat. But Earth was different. At first, many people believed the aliens would not dare to strike with full force. They thought the warnings were only meant to frighten humanity into submission. But then came the first strike. A city, bright and full of life, was reduced to rubble in a single wave of fire from the skies. Millions of voices went silent in an instant. The world shook with grief, and for a brief moment, fear rippled everywhere. That was the invaders' first test. They wanted to see if fear alone could break humanity's spirit. They wanted to know if the loss of one city would make the rest of Earth fall to its knees. In the hours that followed, the world held its breath. Families gathered around screens, listening to the silence that hung heavy after the destruction. Leaders looked at one another, uncertain of what the people would demand. Was survival worth surrendering? Would the fear of losing everything force humanity to obey? But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of begging for mercy, voices began to rise. In the ruins of the destroyed city, survivors stood together and shouted that they would not bow. Across distant lands, crowds filled the streets, not to demand peace through surrender, but to demand resistance. Mothers who had lost children cried out that their pain would not be wasted. Fathers with nothing left in their hands lifted their voices as if their words themselves were weapons. The invaders had expected silence, but they were met with noise. They had expected despair, but they were met with defiance. For humanity, this was the first true test, not of strength, not of weapons, but of will. Could they still stand after losing so much? Could they refuse even when the price of refusal was written in fire and ash? The answer came quickly. Around the world, people began to say the same thing in different languages. "We will not kneel." It became more than a phrase, it became a promise. The invaders responded with another strike. Another city was turned to dust. This time, the screams were louder, the grief heavier. And again, the galaxy watched in silence, expecting Earth to finally break. Yet once more, the humans refused. They gathered in the ruins, lifted their flags above broken ground, and shouted their defiance to the skies. Every time the invaders destroyed something, humans answered with something the aliens could not understand: unity. Nations that had once been divided, suspicious of one another, now began to share supplies, share strategies, and share hope. Borders that had mattered so much before suddenly meant nothing in the face of survival. People saw each other not as separate, but as one people, one world standing together. For the peaceful species watching from afar, this was astonishing. They had always believed that the first test of fear was unbeatable. If the powerful threatened to destroy you, the only path to survival was to surrender. But here, on Earth, the people were rewriting that belief. They were proving that survival, without freedom, was no survival at all. The invaders grew more ruthless. They thought that with each new strike, humanity would grow weaker. But in truth, humanity was becoming stronger. The grief of loss became fuel for courage. Every ruined city became a symbol. Every fallen person a reason to fight harder. Where the invaders thought they were breaking spirits, they were actually building something far more dangerous: a unity of defiance. In underground shelters, people lit candles and whispered promises that they would never give in. In the open streets, others painted symbols of resistance on walls and rooftops. Songs of defiance spread across radios and speakers, carrying hope even into the darkest places. The invaders could destroy buildings, but they could not silence voices. For the galaxy's peaceful watchers, this was the moment they began to feel uneasy. They had told themselves for generations that it was better to bow and live than to stand and burn. But watching Earth, they began to wonder if perhaps they had been wrong all along. Maybe living without freedom was not living. Maybe silence was just another kind of death. The first test was not about weapons or armies. It was about choice. The invaders wanted humanity to choose fear, but instead humanity chose courage. They wanted obedience, but instead humanity chose defiance. And for the first time, the invaders themselves began to feel something unfamiliar: doubt. Because if a species could lose so much and still refuse to kneel, what would it take to actually break them? As the fires of the destroyed cities lit up the night skies, the people of Earth stood taller than ever before. They knew more pain would come, more tests would follow, but they also knew something even more powerful. The invaders could take their homes, their towers, even their lives, but they could not take their will. And so, the first test was passed, not with victory, but with refusal, not with weapons, but with unity. Humanity had shown the galaxy that fear was not always stronger than freedom. For the peaceful species who watched in silence, this was the beginning of their own awakening. If humans could stand in fire and still remain unbroken, then maybe silence was no longer the only path for the weak. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way. And far above Earth, in their massive ships, the invaders finally realized something they had never faced before. This was not going to be easy. The invaders thought they understood how the human mind worked. They had studied many worlds before Earth, crushing one after another until entire galaxies had fallen quiet. To them, resistance was nothing more than a brief delay before surrender. They believed that once fear had spread and loss had piled up, people would choose to bow their heads rather than face the fire again. And in the beginning, it almost seemed as though this would be the case with Earth too. Cities burned, voices cried out, and the skies seemed heavy with despair. But what the invaders could not see, what they had never faced before, was the hidden strength that grew in the hearts of ordinary people. Humanity was scarred. but instead of breaking, they became harder, stronger, and more determined. It was not the weapons they built, nor the armies they raised, that frightened the invaders the most. It was something far less visible, but far more powerful: the spirit of humanity itself. Every time destruction came, the survivors rose with a fire in their eyes that the aliens could not understand. A mother who had lost her home carried her child across ruined streets, whispering promises that no conqueror would ever take their future. An old man sat among the ashes of his village, carving symbols of defiance into broken stone. A young worker who had never held a weapon before stood guard at the entrance of an underground shelter, willing to fight with nothing but his hands, if it came to that. Stories like these began to spread across the world, carried on voices, radios, and even written notes passed from one person to another. They became more than stories. They became proof that humanity's greatest weapon was not in their machines, but in their unyielding will to stand even when everything else had fallen. The invaders launched attack after attack, expecting each one to crush the last traces of defiance. But instead, each new strike created more courage, more unity, and more voices declaring that they would never kneel. It was as if the fire the aliens poured upon Earth was not destroying, but forging something stronger. For the first time, the galaxy's silent watchers began to realize that humanity's spirit was unlike anything they had ever seen. Other species had given up long before the cost became unbearable. But here on Earth, people were willing to pay the price of freedom. With everything they had, families lit candles in dark bunkers, children drew symbols of resistance on scraps of paper, and soldiers stood in ruined streets not to claim victory, but to show the world that they would never surrender. What made this spirit even more powerful was that it came from ordinary people. Leaders gave speeches, soldiers stood guard, but it was the common person who carried the greatest weight. Farmers who once worked their fields now carried supplies across dangerous roads. Teachers who once taught lessons in classrooms now taught courage in broken shelters. Neighbors who had never spoken before now became brothers and sisters in the fight for survival. The invaders could not understand this. To them, power was measured in weapons, ships, and armies. They did not know how to measure unity, love, sacrifice, or stubborn courage. And so, no matter how many battles they won, they always felt that victory was slipping further away. Humanity's spirit was not loud in every moment. Sometimes it was quiet, almost invisible. It was in the way people shared the last pieces of bread when there wasn't enough to eat. It was in the way strangers offered shelter to those who had lost everything. It was in the way a song hummed by a child could bring hope to an entire shelter of frightened families. These small acts, multiplied millions of times across the world, became the true wall that the invaders could not tear down. For every city they destroyed, 100 voices rose in defiance. For every family they tried to silence, 1,000 hands worked together to build something new. The galaxy watched in awe as humanity turned grief into strength. The peaceful species who had always chosen surrender began to question their own choices. They wondered if perhaps they had given up too easily, too quickly. They began to whisper to one another, "If the humans can stand against such power, what excuse do we have?" This was the turning point, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of all who were watching. The invaders had power, but humanity had spirit. And slowly, that spirit began to spread beyond Earth, awakening courage in species who had long ago buried their own. On Earth, people continued to fight in their own ways. A worker repairing a broken radio tower so voices of resistance could still be heard. A group of families sharing what little food they had with strangers who had lost everything. A young soldier standing at the edge of a ruined street, holding his ground even when he knew the next wave might be his last. None of them thought of themselves as heroes. They were simply doing what they believed was right. Yet together, they were building something greater than any army, a living example that the human spirit could not be broken. The invaders began to realize a truth they had never faced before. They could win every battle and still be losing the war. Because no matter how much land they burned, no matter how many voices they silenced, they could not erase the fire inside the human heart. And that was when the galaxy understood. Humanity's true power was not in their weapons, but in their refusal to bow. It was a spirit that turned ashes into courage, fear into unity, and loss into strength. The first test had shown that humans would not surrender. The second had shown that destruction only made them stronger. Now, in this moment, the galaxy saw the full truth. Humanity's spirit was a force no conqueror could ever fully defeat. The invaders, for all their power, had underestimated the one thing they could never conquer. And as the fires of Earth lit up the skies, the world stood together. Not victorious, not unscathed, but unbroken. And that, more than any weapon, was what made humanity dangerous. The invaders had reached the point where they believed the end was near. Earth was scarred, cities were in ruins, and the skies were heavy with smoke. From their point of view, it was only a matter of time before humanity bent to their will, as so many other species had done before. They had crushed entire civilizations with far less effort. Why would humans be any different? Yet, in the ashes of defeat, humanity was preparing for something far greater than the invaders could imagine, the moment of truth. This was not a moment defined by weapons or numbers, but by choice. Humanity stood at the edge of survival, with two paths open before them. One was the easy path, surrender, kneel, and accept life under the invaders. The other was a path lined with fire, sacrifice, and the unknown. But at the end of that second path was something worth more than safety. It was freedom, dignity, and the right to remain human. The invaders sent their demands once again. Their message was clear: kneel and be spared, resist and be erased. But this time, the words fell into silence. Humanity no longer trembled when the threats echoed through broken radios or burning skies. Instead, they gathered quietly, in bunkers, in ruined towns, in mountains and forests. The people knew that this choice would define not just their future, but the memory of what it meant to be human. It was in these quiet gatherings that the decision was made. If Earth could not be saved, then it would not be given away. If freedom could not be lived, then it would be protected with the last breath, the last weapon, the last spark of courage. People who had never held a gun before now prepared themselves to defend what little remained. Engineers rewired old machines into weapons. Farmers carried fuel and supplies to underground bases. Children, too young to fight, became messengers, carrying words of defiance from one shelter to another. The invaders expected fear. What they found instead was resolve, and that resolve was terrifying to them. For the first time, the conquerors faced a species that looked at certain defeat and said, "We will not kneel." The moment of truth came not with one great battle, but with millions of small choices made across the world. A soldier choosing to stand guard even though the enemy's arrival meant certain death. A family deciding to stay in their ruined home, not to hide, but to refuse the conqueror's entry. A group of workers lighting fires in the night sky, creating signals to show that humanity was still alive, still fighting, still unbroken. When the invaders launched what they believed would be their final assault, something unexpected happened. Humanity did not scatter. They did not hide. Instead, they rose together, not with the hope of winning, but with the certainty of refusing. They fought in the streets, in the forests, in the ruins of their cities, and wherever one human fell, another stepped forward. The skies lit up with flames, not only from the invaders' attacks, but from humanity's own decision. Earth itself became a symbol of resistance. Buildings were set alight to deny the enemy shelter. Bridges were destroyed to block their paths. Even entire cities, once symbols of civilization, became burning testaments that humans would rather see them destroyed than surrendered. The invaders watched with shock. They had never faced such defiance. To them, conquest was about control. But how could they control a people who would rather burn their own world than hand it over? The more they pushed, the stronger humanity's spirit burned. The galaxy's peaceful species, watching from the shadows, felt their hearts stir. For generations, they had chosen the path of safety, surrendering whenever the conquerors came. But now, they saw something they had never imagined. Humanity, fragile and scarred, was willing to stand in fire and still shout, "We are free!" For the first time, these silent watchers questioned their own choices. Perhaps safety was not the highest value. Perhaps dignity was greater than survival. On Earth, the cost was high. Families were separated, cities turned to ashes, and lives lost beyond count. But with every sacrifice came a message louder than any weapon. Humanity could be wounded, but it could not be broken. The invaders, who had once mocked the weakness of human weapons, now found themselves shaken by human resolve. They had the technology to destroy, but not the strength to inspire. They had the power to conquer, but not the courage to endure what humans were enduring willingly. This truth unsettled them in ways no weapon ever could. The moment of truth revealed something deeper. It showed that humanity's greatest power was not in victory, but in refusal. They were proving that freedom was not something to be handed over or bargained with. It was something to be lived for, fought for, and, if needed, sacrificed for. And so, even as the skies burned and the ground trembled, there was hope. Not the kind of hope that promised an easy tomorrow, but the kind that gave strength in the darkest night. Hope that came from knowing that the choice had been made, and it was the right one. The invaders saw it too. They realized that no matter how many bombs they dropped, no matter how many battles they won, the humans would never kneel. And a truth more frightening than any weapon echoed through their minds. A species that refused to surrender could never truly be conquered. In that moment, Earth became more than just a battleground. It became a symbol, a place where freedom was valued more than life itself, a world that showed the galaxy what it meant to choose defiance over chains. And though humanity stood on the edge of destruction, they stood with pride. They stood with fire in their eyes and courage in their hearts. They stood knowing that history, and even the stars themselves, would remember this moment of truth, not as the time humanity was defeated, but as the time humanity proved unbreakable. The war on Earth left scars deeper than any wound. Cities were burned, forests turned to ash, and oceans carried the wreckage of battles that seemed endless. Yet in the silence that followed, something greater remained. Humanity had not won with weapons, nor had they defeated the invaders in the traditional sense. Instead, they had done something far more powerful. They had shown the galaxy what it meant to defy. They had taught a lesson that could not be erased by fire or death. The peaceful species that had once watched from a distance now found themselves unable to forget what they had seen. For centuries, these civilizations had chosen silence when danger came. They believed survival was enough, even if it meant surrendering their pride, their freedom, and their future. To them, bending the knee was easier than breaking under the weight of war. But after watching humanity, they realized something had been missing all along. They had survived, yes, but at the cost of their souls. When the invaders moved on from Earth, they carried with them not a victory, but a wound of their own. For the first time, they had faced a people who refused submission. They could destroy, but they could not conquer. They left Earth scarred, but Earth left them haunted. And that haunting spread across the stars, reaching even the quietest corners of the galaxy. The peaceful species, once silent, began to whisper among themselves. They replayed the images they had witnessed, humans standing together in burning, cities refusing to kneel even when surrounded, fighting even when defeat was certain. These images sparked questions in minds that had long been quiet. Was survival enough if it meant living without freedom? Could dignity be preserved by surrender? Or was dignity something that only existed when one chose to resist? In the gatherings of distant worlds, the lesson of Earth was spoken aloud. Some said, "The humans are reckless. They risked everything." But others replied, "Yes, and in risking everything, they found something greater. They found themselves." Slowly, the thought spread. Perhaps courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand even when fear was overwhelming. The galaxy began to change. The next time the invaders came to a small world expecting the usual surrender, they were met with hesitation. A people who once would have lowered their heads remembered Earth. They remembered the flames of defiance, the voices that shouted, "We will not kneel!" For the first time, the invaders saw resistance before a single blow had been struck. This resistance did not always mean battles. Sometimes it was the refusal to obey orders. Sometimes it was a village refusing to hand over supplies. Sometimes it was the quiet bravery of a people refusing to forget their freedom, no matter how powerful. Their enemy. And in every small act, the echo of humanity was present. Back on Earth, survivors rebuilt what they could. Life was hard, but life continued. Children grew up hearing stories not just of destruction, but of courage. They were told how their parents and grandparents had chosen fire over chains, how they had proved that the human spirit was stronger than fear. And as they grew, these children carried those lessons with pride. The galaxy, too, carried the memory of Earth. For generations, people would say, "Remember the humans. They taught us how to stand." And though humanity had paid the highest price, they had given something priceless in return. They had shown that no power, no matter how overwhelming, could erase freedom from the heart of a determined people. The invaders, once feared as unstoppable, began to face new difficulties. Every world they reached was no longer quiet. Every people they tried to dominate remembered the lesson of Earth. The conquerors still had their weapons, their ships, their armies. But what they lacked was the one thing humanity had awakened across the stars: defiance. That was humanity's true victory. Not in winning battles, but in changing the way the galaxy thought. They had become a mirror, showing others what was possible. They had turned silence into resistance, fear into courage. Generations later, when the stories were told, Earth was remembered not as a broken world, but as the birthplace of a new idea. An idea that spread from one planet to another like fire through dry grass. The idea that freedom was worth more than survival, that dignity mattered more than safety, and that no conqueror could ever truly win against a people who refused to kneel. The peaceful species who had once believed themselves weak discovered strength in the memory of Earth. They no longer saw defiance as madness, but as wisdom. They no longer believed submission was the only path, but instead saw courage as a choice open to all. Humanity had given them this gift without asking for anything in return. The lesson was clear and eternal. Strength is not measured only in weapons or numbers, but in the will to stand when surrender seems easier. The humans had shown that one spark of defiance could light the darkness for all. And so, the galaxy changed, not because of human technology, not because of human power, but because of the human spirit. A spirit that refused to bend, refused to be broken, and refused to let fear decide the future. The invaders had thought they would erase Earth from history. Instead, Earth became the most remembered world of all, a world that taught the galaxy that freedom is not given, it is chosen, a world that proved even in defeat there can be victory. That was humanity's legacy, a lesson for the galaxy, a lesson written not in words but in courage, a lesson that would live forever in the hearts of all who long to be free.